There is a particular quality to the silence just before a Japanese dawn that I have never been able to explain to anyone who has not lived inside it. It is not the absence of sound. It is something closer to the world holding its breath, a pause so complete, so thoroughly familiar that after enough years you begin to believe the silence is yours, that the morning is waiting for you specifically to open your eyes before it will consent to begin. I believed this for many years. I believed many things that turned out to be true only within a very specific set of conditions. Conditions that I watched dissolve, slowly and then all at once, across the arc of my middle years. But that is not where this story begins. This story begins in the silence, in the dark, in the particular smell of tatami and wood smoke and cold morning air that still comes to me, even now, when I close my eyes and allow myself to return to what I was. My name, for the purposes of this account, matters less than my position. I was a samurai, a mid-ranking retainer, what the official registers called a hatamoto, a bannerman in service to one of the western domains. Not a great samurai of history, not a figure whose name you would find in the chronicles of the age. I was one of the hundreds of thousands of men who wore the two swords and administered the documents and performed the rituals, and genuinely believed, with a completeness that I can only now recognize as a form of faith, that the world in which they lived was stable, permanent, and essentially correct. I was a man of my time in the most complete sense. I could not see my time from outside it. None of us could. That inability, I have since come to understand, was not a flaw of character. It was simply the condition of being alive in a world before it knows itself to be ending. I want to take you inside that world, not the world of textbooks and timelines and the clean, backward-facing logic of historical inevitability. I want to take you inside the world as it felt from the inside, the smells, the textures, the specific quality of anxiety that rises in the chest of a man who senses that something is wrong, but has not yet been given the vocabulary to name it. I want to tell you about the morning light in the administrative hall, about the weight of formal dress on a summer afternoon, about the particular silence that followed certain conversations, a silence that carried more information than the words that preceded it, about the night the black ships came, and what it felt like to be a man whose entire existence was organized around a set of assumptions that a foreign admiral, with his coal-burning engines and his cannon and his total indifference to the order of things, was about to render obsolete. But first, the beginning, the part that I loved, the part that, if I am being honest with myself, I still love, even knowing what it cost. I was born in the 23rd year of the Bunka era, which the Western calendar would record as 1826, into a family that had held its modest samurai rank for 4 generations. My father was a document administrator in the service of our domain lord. His father had been the same. His father before him had earned the rank through some act of military service in an era when military service was still occasionally required, and the rank had been passed down with the same quiet inevitability as the family's writing desk and the particular way we held a brush. I grew up understanding that I would become what my father was. This understanding was not presented to me as a limitation. It was presented as a form of grace, as the natural expression of a world in proper order, where every person occupied the position that heaven had arranged for them, and where the occupying of that position with diligence and integrity was itself the highest form of virtue. The house I grew up in was not large. 4 rooms, a narrow garden, a well. The garden had 3 old stones that I spent many hours of my childhood arranging and rearranging without any clear theory about what I was trying to achieve. My mother maintained the garden with a care that I understood only much later was her form of philosophy, a daily practice of attending to small things with full attention, on the theory that the small things, properly tended, would hold the large things in place. I inherited this theory. I held it through conditions it was never designed to survive, and it served me better than almost anything else I was given. My formal education began at 7. The domain maintained a school for the sons of samurai retainers, a modest building near the administrative quarter where we studied the Chinese classics, calligraphy, mathematics of a practical kind, and the basic codes of behavior that organized our world. I was a diligent student, not a brilliant one. I had a good memory for text and a poor instinct for the social hierarchies of the schoolroom, which operated with their own intricate grammar of status and deference that was, I gradually understood, a practice run for the grammar we would inhabit for the rest of our lives. I learned the grammar. I became fluent in it. And like any language absorbed in childhood, it stopped feeling like a language after a while. It felt like simply the way the world was. The classics I studied most carefully were the texts of the Neo-Confucian tradition, the philosophy that formed the ideological foundation of the Tokugawa order, the 5 relationships, the supreme importance of loyalty, the understanding that a well-ordered society was one in which each person understood their position and fulfilled its obligations with complete sincerity. I read these texts with something that I can only describe as recognition, the sensation of encountering, in formal language, what I already knew in my bones to be true. The world had an order. I had a place in it. The place was good, and the order was just, and the work of a life was to inhabit that place with as much integrity as one could bring to it. This seemed obvious to me. It seemed, if I am being precise, like simple reality. I completed my formal schooling at 15 and entered a period of apprenticeship within the domain's administrative structure, working alongside my father in the document-keeping offices. The work was meticulous and repetitive, and I loved it with a completeness that now seems, from this distance, almost innocent. There were hundreds of documents, land surveys, tax records, correspondence between the domain and the shogunate, the intricate arithmetic of rice stipends and their distributions. I copied them by hand. I organized them by category and year. I learned the handwriting of 3 generations of domain administrators, which is a form of intimacy with the dead that I have since come to value as one of the stranger gifts of my profession. The dead speak clearly in their documents. They are not trying to perform anything. They are simply trying to record what was true. And in that simplicity, something genuine survives. My father died when I was 19 from a respiratory illness that moved quickly and gave very little warning. The grief I felt was not the theatrical grief of the classical texts, not the elaborate, formally coded sorrow of a man performing his loss within a recognized tradition. It was simpler and heavier than that. He had been the primary evidence in my daily life that the world I inhabited was real and worth inhabiting. He had moved through it with such consistency, such quiet dignity, that his presence was itself a form of argument for the world's validity. When he was gone, I noticed for the first time that I was making the argument for myself. that I was the one doing the inhabiting, now without the proof of his example to lean on. I was 19. I stood straighter. I kept his desk exactly as he had left it for a year before I allowed myself to arrange it as my own. At 22, I married. My wife came from a merchant family of a specific kind. They were not the grand wholesale merchants of Osaka or Edo, the men whose financial power had quietly restructured the economy, while the official hierarchy maintained its insistence that they were the lowest of the four social orders. Her family operated a textile business in the castle town, modest in scale, but remarkably consistent in its returns. Her father was a careful man, a reader, someone who had educated his daughter with an unusually serious commitment for a merchant household of that era. She could read not just the common syllabaries, but a significant amount of classical text. She understood mathematics better than most of my colleagues. She expressed none of this in company because the social grammar of our world required a merchant woman to present herself as something smaller than she was, and she had learned the grammar as completely as I had. The marriage was arranged through the conventional intermediaries. I do not know what she thought of me when we first met in the formal setting that precluded any real exchange of information. I was wearing my best formal clothes, which were respectable but not extravagant. I had rehearsed the appropriate responses to the appropriate questions. She had done the same. We looked at each other across the managed distance of ceremony and exchanged nothing genuine whatsoever. This was correct. This was the grammar. What came after was more interesting. The private life that assembled itself gradually over years in the space behind the formal presentation, that was something I had not been given a text for. We were not taught how to actually inhabit a marriage, only how to perform its rituals. The private life required improvisation, and improvisation requires honesty, and honesty requires the willingness to be seen without the formal clothes. I was not very good at this at first. Neither was she. We learned together, quietly, over a long time. It was one of the better educations I received. The house we moved into was slightly larger than the one I had grown up in. 6 rooms, a garden of moderate size, a view from the back rooms of the hills beyond the castle town. The stipend I received from the domain was adequate for a life of dignified simplicity, which is to say, adequate for a life in which the gap between dignity and simplicity remained imperceptible from the outside, which required an ongoing arithmetic that I performed quietly in my head at irregular intervals and never discussed with anyone. Every family in our social stratum was performing this same arithmetic. We all knew it. We did not discuss it. The silence was its own form of solidarity. My days had the quality of ritual, and I mean this in the deepest possible sense. Every element of a day had its appointed time and form. I woke in the dark in the hour before dawn and lay still for a few minutes listening to the silence before it was replaced by the morning's first sounds. Then I rose. I washed my face in the cold water that sat in the basin near the garden entrance. The cold was important. Part of it was the first small act of discipline in a day made entirely of small acts of discipline. I dressed in the order prescribed by convention, undergarment, inner robe, outer robe, and then, for any day in which I would appear in the administrative quarter, the formal hakama that transformed my body into something public and representative, a figure in a system rather than merely a man in a house. The hakama had a particular weight and presence that I grew to rely on in ways I could not have articulated at the time. When I wore it, I was not only myself. I was also my father and his father and the 4 generations of our family's service to this domain. The formal dress was a form of memory-made material, a way of carrying the past into the present moment without having to speak it. I put it on the way I imagine a priest puts on vestments, with attention, with acknowledgement of what the garment means, with the understanding that the wearing of it is itself an act of affirmation. The walk from my house to the administrative quarter took 12 minutes. I know this not because I ever timed it, but because my body knew it, the way the body knows distances it has walked hundreds of times, measuring them not in units but in the passage of internal weather. Along the way I passed the temple, where the bell rang at precise intervals throughout the day, and the small covered market where the morning's first vendors were arranging their goods, and the house of a senior administrator whose morning routine I had observed so many times that I could tell from the quality of the smoke from his kitchen fire whether the household had risen on schedule or had been delayed by something, an illness, a late night, a small domestic crisis, of the kind that every household produces and absorbs without report. I greeted everyone I passed with precisely calibrated deference. Not the same greeting for everyone. That would have been a failure of the grammar. A deep and careful bow for those above me in the hierarchy. A measured acknowledgment for those alongside me. A particular combination of warmth and formality for those below me that was meant to convey both the inequality of our positions and the genuine respect I held for anyone who performed their role with integrity. I had not calculated this system. I had absorbed it so thoroughly that it operated below the level of conscious thought, the way breathing operates, the way balance operates. The social grammar of the Tokugawa order was not something I thought about. It was something I was made of. The administrative office where I spent my working hours was a room of perhaps 20 feet by 15, with screens along the south wall that could be opened to admit light and air in the warmer months and were kept closed against the cold from late autumn through early spring. The smell of the room was the smell of my working life. Ink and paper and the particular dusty warmth of old documents stored in lacquered boxes along the north wall. There were 4 of us who worked in that room, plus a rotating series of junior staff who brought tea and carried messages, and eventually, if they demonstrated sufficient diligence, were given the responsibility of copying documents under supervision. My work was, in its essence, the maintenance of records. Land surveys, tax assessments, correspondence logs, personnel files, the documentation of decisions made by the domain's senior administrators. The domain, like all domains, was a complex organization, a government, an agricultural system, a military organization, a social order, and its proper functioning required that what had been decided was accurately recorded, that what had been recorded was accurately stored, and that what had been stored could be retrieved when the question of what had been decided arose again, as questions always do. I was a keeper of institutional memory. The work seemed to me, and still seems to me, genuinely important. In the afternoons, when the document work was complete or had reached a natural resting point, I practiced the martial arts that my rank required me to maintain. Kenjutsu twice weekly, the formalized practice of sword technique with a senior instructor and a small group of men in my approximate position and age. I want to be precise about what this practice meant in my life because it would be easy to misunderstand it. I was not training for war. Japan had not had a serious internal military conflict for 2 centuries. The senior instructor was a man of approximately 60, whose father had been a child during the last period of genuine samurai military engagement, and even that engagement had been modest by historical standards. What we were doing in the practice sessions was not preparing for combat. We were performing an inheritance. The practice was beautiful in a way that I find difficult to convey to someone who has not experienced it. The forms had been refined over centuries into a kind of kinetic philosophy, a physical argument about the relationship between attention and action, between stillness and force, between the self and its context. To practice a form correctly was to think correctly, to be present in a specific way that ordinary daily life did not require and could not produce. The physical discipline was inseparable from the mental discipline. You could not execute a technique with a divided or distracted mind. The form would simply fail, and the failure was immediate and visible and correctable in a way that most of life's failures are not. I love the practice for this reason above all. It was one of the few arenas in which the relationship between integrity and outcome was direct and transparent. I was competent, but not exceptional. My body was suited to the technical aspects of the practice. I had good balance and a naturally still center, but I lacked the quality of focused aggression that the highest levels of the art seemed to require. My instructor told me once, in the carefully indirect language of his generation, that I practiced as though I were trying to understand something rather than trying to win. I took this as a rebuke. He may have meant it as a description. Looking back, it seems to me the most accurate thing anyone said about me during those years. The evenings were domestic. My wife and I ate together, and the conversation that developed over those years of shared meals was one of the most important educations of my life. She was more perceptive than I was about certain things, about people, about the underlying dynamics of situations that I tended to read at face value, about the specific flavor of anxiety that circulated through the samurai quarter in the years of my middle age like a low-frequency sound that everyone could feel, but no one would name. She noticed things. She mentioned them to me carefully in the formulation of questions or observations that were never direct enough to constitute pressure, but always direct enough to leave their mark. I understood after many years that she was helping me see. I did not always thank her for this. I was too busy, too often, performing the composure that my class required. I had, at this stage of my life, no language for what I was noticing in the world around me. I noticed that the domain's finances were under a strain that was not discussed in official language but was visible in a dozen indirect signs: the quality of the paper the domain used for correspondence, the slight reduction in the ceremonial gifts distributed at the new year, the tone of certain conversations among senior administrators that had shifted from the measured confidence of men who knew their resources were adequate to the slightly tighter, slightly more careful tone of men who were doing arithmetic they preferred not to share. I noticed that the merchant quarter of the castle town was, by comparison, in a state of visible prosperity. New buildings went up. Textiles of noticeably higher quality appeared in the markets. The sons of merchants walked with an ease that was not quite the ease of our class. It was more physical, less formal, and somehow more expensive. I noticed this. I did not assemble it into an argument. To assemble it into an argument would have required me to conclude something that I was not yet ready to conclude. The world was correct. The order was just. My father had believed this, and his father before him, and the entire philosophical architecture of our civilization rested on this foundation. A samurai who began to question the foundation was not a thinker. He was a man who had failed in the primary obligation of his class, which was not military service. Japan had not needed that in living memory, but faith. Faith in the structure, faith in the order, faith that the arrangement of the world into its proper categories was not merely a historical accident, but an expression of something genuinely true about how human beings should live together. I had this faith. I want to be clear about this because it would be easy from the outside to read the story of what came next as the story of a man who was always secretly skeptical and who eventually found the courage to acknowledge what he had always suspected. That is not my story. My faith was real. It was not naive. I was an educated man, and I had read enough history to understand that the Tokugawa order was one arrangement among possible arrangements, not the only possible arrangement. But I believed it was the best arrangement available, and I believed this not because I had never considered alternatives, but because the alternatives I was aware of seemed worse. The chaos of the period before the Tokugawa consolidation, the century of warring states, the villages burned and the roads made impassable by private armies, was present in our historical memory as a vivid negative image of what the current order had replaced. The peace was real. The order was real. The stability was real. I had lived inside it my entire life, and it had given me everything I valued, my position, my practice, my work, the conversation at the evening table. I was not pretending to believe in it. I believed in it. This is what I want you to understand as you settle into the darkness and let these words carry you. The world I am describing was not a costume. It was not a performance over an emptiness. It was a genuine civilization with genuine beauty and genuine meaning, inhabited by genuine people who loved their lives as they found them, and who did not know, could not have known, that the conditions of that loving were about to become, very slowly, and then very suddenly, impossible. The first sign that something was shifting was so quiet that I nearly missed it. I nearly did miss it, in fact, for several years. It came in the form of a conversation with a colleague, a man I respected, a senior document administrator named Watanabe, who had been sent by the domain to Edo for several months on a matter of administrative business, and had recently returned. We were walking back from the administrative quarter on an afternoon in late autumn, and the trees along the path had gone to copper and yellow, and the air had that particular quality of Japanese autumn that always seemed to me like the world at its most honest, stripped of summer's comfortable fullness, revealing the bones of things. Watanabe mentioned that Edo felt different from when he had last visited several years prior. I asked how. He considered this for a longer time than the question seemed to warrant. Changed, he said finally. Not in any way you could point to, but changed in the way that a room changes when a decision has been made in it that hasn't been spoken yet. The quality of the air is different. The conversations stop and start differently. There are more silences, and the silences feel occupied. I asked him what he thought it meant. He said he didn't know. He said he hoped it meant nothing. He said he was probably imagining it. And then we talked about something else, and I filed the conversation away in the part of my mind that I had not yet learned to call the part that knew things before I was ready to know them. But the stone had been dropped into the still water. The concentric rings moved outward from that point, silently, in all directions. In the years that followed that conversation, I began to notice more. I noticed that certain books circulated among my colleagues with an urgency that their official titles didn't explain. Texts of history and philosophy, and increasingly of what I learned to call Rangaku, Dutch studies, the body of knowledge that came into Japan through the single open trading port at Dejima in Nagasaki. I did not read these texts myself, not at first. My position did not require me to read them, and my instinct was that engaging with them would constitute a kind of disloyalty, not disloyalty to my lord, but disloyalty to the way the world was organized. The foreign knowledge implied that the existing knowledge was insufficient. I was not ready to accept that implication. But I noticed the books. I noticed who borrowed them and who returned them, and how their faces looked subtly in the weeks after. I noticed that Watanabe had acquired a text on Western cartography, which he kept in the lower drawer of his desk with the careful casualness of a man who has decided to be incurious about whether you have noticed. I noticed that two of the younger administrators in the domain, men who had grown up in my colleague's generation, a decade younger than I was, attended what were described officially as study sessions, but were, by the quality of their conversation in the days following, something more urgent than the study of texts. I noticed the domain's finances continuing to tighten. The rice stipend that constituted the primary income of virtually every samurai family in Japan was a fixed quantity, denominated in rice, in an economy that was increasingly operating in cash. The merchant economy had grown up around and through and eventually under the samurai economy, like the roots of a large tree under a stone wall, imperceptible at first, then gradually displacing the stone. My stipend bought less every year, not because the stipend was smaller, but because the things I needed to buy required money rather than rice, and the exchange rate between the two moved in a direction that I chose, year after year, not to analyze too carefully. My wife's family, by contrast, was doing extremely well. The textile business had expanded. Her father had acquired a second property in the merchant quarter. Her brother had taken on 2 apprentices and was speaking about a third. The wealth was not displayed ostentatiously. Merchant families in Japan had centuries of practice in managing the gap between their actual prosperity and the official expectation of their modest subordination, but it was visible to anyone paying attention, and I was paying attention, though I was careful not to arrange what I saw into a conclusion. There was a transaction in my marriage that I want to describe honestly, because I think it carries something important about the world I am trying to show you. Several years after we were married, there was a gap in the household accounts, a specific moment when the arithmetic of our dignified simplicity produced a number that was clearly and irrefutably negative. There was not enough. The rice harvest that year had been poor, the domain's payments were slightly delayed, and we had incurred an unusual expense, a medical matter, nothing severe, but enough to disturb the balance. My wife saw the gap before I did, or rather she saw it at the same time I did, but she saw what it meant more quickly. She arranged, through her family, through her mother, through the kind of conversation that happened in domestic spaces that I was not present for and was not expected to inquire about a loan. The loan was structured as a family matter, as support flowing from her parents to their daughter, which was entirely normal, entirely unremarkable, entirely outside the categories that would have required me to feel that a samurai was borrowing money from a merchant. I understood exactly what the transaction was. My wife understood that I understood. Neither of us said so. She was protecting me from having to say so, and I was permitting her to do this, and we both understood the other's understanding, and the conversation that this mutual understanding would have produced was replaced by a silence that was tender and practical, and a little sad, the kind of silence that a marriage develops when the people inside it have both decided that certain truths are better honored obliquely than directly, because the oblique acknowledgment leaves the necessary fictions intact, and the direct one would cost more than the saving was worth. I think about that silence often. I think it was the most honest moment of my first 20 years of adult life. The famine came over several years, building slowly and then arriving with a force that surprised even the administrators who had been tracking the harvest reports and should not have been surprised. The tempo era brought cold summers and flooding in the north and drought in the south, and the rice failed in ways that the domain's emergency granaries were not equipped to compensate for. I saw the effects not in my own household, which was protected by the domain stipend and the private loan and my wife's family's relative prosperity, but in the streets and in the documents. The documents were the more revealing record. Tax collection reports from the rural districts, appeals for emergency distribution, records of population movement, people leaving their registered villages, which was technically illegal, but practically unstoppable when the alternative was starvation. I copied these documents with my careful hand and filed them in the lacquered boxes, and tried not to assemble them into a picture. But the picture assembled itself, as pictures do when you handle their components every day. The domain was in trouble. The broader shogunate was in trouble. The famine was not merely an agricultural crisis. It was a political crisis because the fundamental contract of the Tokugawa order was the promise of stability, the promise that the elaborate system of controls and hierarchies and enforced peace was worth what it cost in freedom and flexibility, because the alternative was suffering, and the shogunate's suffering would be less than the suffering of the warring state's alternative. When the famine came, and the suffering was enormous anyway, when people died in numbers that the official documents recorded with their characteristic exactness and their characteristic emotional flatness, the contract began to be visible as a contract rather than as simply the nature of things. In 1837, I was 11 years into my career and 31 years old. I heard about the Oshio uprising not through official channels. The official channels processed such information slowly, carefully, through the particular bureaucratic solvent that transformed urgent events into manageable administrative categories, but through the kind of informal communication that ran through the samurai community like a secondary nervous system. A former magistrate in Osaka, a samurai named Oshio Hayachiro, had led an armed uprising of the urban poor against the city's administration. He had burned a significant portion of Osaka before being defeated. He had been a samurai. He had chosen the starving merchants and peasants over his institutional superiors. The uprising was suppressed in a day. In the official history, it was a minor incident, a disturbed individual, a local failure of social management, a temporary aberration in the general stability. In the informal conversations that circulated through our community in the weeks following, it was something else entirely. The element that nobody could successfully digest was not the violence. Violence had occurred in Japan before, would occur again, but the identity of the man who had committed it, a samurai, an educated man, a man who had held a position of genuine institutional authority and who had voluntarily abandoned it, burned his house and his books and most of his possessions, and gone into the streets with the people who occupied the lowest position in the official order. He had not acted from private grievance. He had acted from a philosophical position, from an argument about where the moral authority of the samurai class actually lay and what a samurai owed to the people rather than to the institution. I did not agree with him. I want to be precise about this. I believed when I heard about the uprising that he had made a catastrophic error, that he had confused a form of loyalty with its substance, that his action, however sincere its moral foundation, would accomplish nothing except to give the authorities an excuse to crack down on the limited space for intellectual dissent that existed within the system. I believed the structures needed to be reformed from within, not challenged from without. But the argument he had made, the argument underneath the action, I could not dismiss. I had read the same texts. I had been formed by the same philosophical tradition. The Neo-Confucian understanding of loyalty was not unconditional deference to authority. It was conditional, contingent obligation-bearing. A ruler who failed in his obligations to the people forfeited the moral authority that justified the people's obligations to him. This was not a foreign idea. This was inside the very texts that the shogunate had made the foundation of its ideological legitimacy. Oshio had used the shogunate's own philosophy against it, and the shogunate could not refute him philosophically without undermining its own foundations. It could only suppress him militarily, which it did, and hope that the argument died with the man. The argument did not die with the man. I know this because I carried it. I carried it in the form of a question that I could not entirely close. What does loyalty actually require? Not what does loyalty look like, not what does loyalty cost, but what does it actually require when you strip away the form and look at the substance underneath? I did not act on this question. I want to be clear about this. I went to work. I copied my documents. I practiced my sword forms twice a week. I ate with my wife, and we talked about the garden and the domain's affairs and the progress of our 2 children, who were born in those years and who organized our evenings around their needs with a welcome authority. I was, to all outward appearances, a man who had absorbed the information available to him and proceeded with his duties without disturbance. This was the correct behavior. This was what my training required. But the question was inside me now, working slowly, the way water works inside stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but with a persistence that eventually changes the shape of things. The years continued. My children grew. My son showed a gift for mathematics that I quietly encouraged beyond the requirements of his official curriculum. My daughter had her mother's perceptiveness and her mother's way of rendering visible, through the quality of her attention, things that other people had decided not to see. The domain continued its careful management of diminishing resources. The shogunate issued reform edicts, the tempo reforms under the regent Mizuno Tadakuni, that were comprehensive, severe and moralistic, attempting to legislate away luxury and reassert the official hierarchy's primacy over the merchant culture that had grown up around it like an elaborate, persistent weed. The reforms prohibited certain theatrical performances. They restricted the sale of certain goods. They attempted to relocate merchant guilds in ways that disrupted established trade networks. They failed comprehensively and publicly within 2 years of their implementation, and Mizuno was removed from his position. I watched the failure of the reforms with a feeling that I spent a considerable time trying to correctly identify. It was not satisfaction. I had no interest in the shogunate's failure. It was not surprise. I had read enough administrative history to understand that reforms aimed at rolling back economic forces rather than accommodating them tended to produce the outcome that the reforms were trying to prevent. It was something closer to sadness. The failure of the reforms was evidence that the system could not fix itself through the mechanisms the system provided. And if the system could not fix itself, then either it would be fixed by something outside the system, or it would not be fixed at all. I mentioned none of this to my colleagues. I mentioned it to my wife, carefully, in the indirect register that serious conversations between us had gradually developed over the years. She listened and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have been wondering when you would say something like that." We did not elaborate further. We went to bed. I lay in the dark for a long time listening to the silence, which had a different quality that night. Not the silence of a world in order, but the silence of a world in which the order was being quietly renegotiated, and no one had yet told the silence what the new arrangement would be. The following year, a colleague invited me to attend what he described as an informal reading group. The description was accurate enough to be technically true and misleading enough to constitute a kind of social test. Was I the kind of man who would engage with ideas that were not officially sanctioned, or was I the kind of man who would make his excuses and preserve his distance? I considered the invitation for several days. My wife did not advise me either way. This, too, was a form of advice. I went. There were 8 of us gathered in the study of a man I knew slightly, a scholar of moderate seniority who had, I now understood, been circling at the edges of the intellectual community that had formed around the question of Japan's situation for several years. The texts being discussed that evening were not the prohibited texts, not the ones that would have attracted official attention. They were historical accounts of earlier periods of Japanese instability, the collapse of earlier governing orders, the transition periods between eras. The discussion was ostensibly historical. It was, in fact, about the present, conducted in the grammar of the past, which is a form of conversation that educated people in every era and every culture have used when the present is too dangerous to discuss directly. What struck me most was not what was said, but how it was said. These were men who had thought seriously about the relationship between the form of an institution and its function, who understood that Tokugawa system's genius had been to make these two things coincide, to create forms that genuinely serve the functions they claimed to serve, but that the coincidence was wearing thin. That form and function were coming apart in small ways and then in larger ways, and that the question of what a person of integrity should do when this happened was not a theoretical question anymore. I went home that evening and sat in the garden for a while, even though it was cold and late. The 3 old stones from my childhood were in the garden by then. I had brought them with me when I moved into this house after my father's death, which was the kind of thing my colleagues would have found sentimental, and my wife understood immediately. I looked at the stones. I thought about the question of form and function. I thought about a man I had once known whose entire sense of self had been organized around his position in a system, and about what happened to that man when the system began, quietly, to become unable to support the weight of the meaning that had been placed on it. Then I went inside. I went to sleep. But the reading group was the last night I slept with the undivided faith that had been given to me in childhood. After that night I slept with something underneath the faith, a question, awake in the dark, asking itself. It was in the 7th month of the 6th year of the Kai era, July of 1853, as the Western calendar would name it, that the black ships came to Edo Bay. I was not in Edo when it happened. I was in our domain 3 days' journey to the west, in the administrative office where I had spent the better part of my adult life. The news reached me through the domain's messenger network, with an unusual quality of silence attached to it, as though the messengers had been instructed to deliver the information but had not been given instructions about what expression to wear while doing so, and had defaulted, in the absence of instruction, to a careful blankness that communicated, more precisely than any expression would have, the fact that nobody knew what expression was appropriate. 4 foreign warships, American, coal-burning, had entered Edo Bay without permission and anchored within sight of the capital. Their commander had presented a letter from the American president requesting the opening of trade relations. He had made clear, through the medium of his ship's cannon and the coal-black smoke rising from his steam engines, that this request was not precisely optional. He had then departed, leaving the letter, leaving the clear impression that he would return for an answer, and leaving behind a silence in the Tokugawa political order that was of a completely different quality from any silence I had ever encountered before. The shogunate's response to the black ships was unprecedented in ways that took some time to fully understand. They did not simply decide. They consulted. They circulated the American letter to the domain lords and asked for their opinions. This had never happened. For 2.5 centuries the shogunate had governed through a system of controlled, hierarchical decision-making in which the domain lords were, in theory, sovereign within their domains, and in practice, carefully managed to prevent any accumulation of independent political authority. The shogunate consulted no one. The shogunate decided, and the domain lords implemented. The consultation of 1853 was not a gesture of democratic openness. It was a confession of uncertainty so severe that the machinery of normal governance had ceased to function. When word of the consultation reached our domain, the senior administrators met in a session that was closed to most staff, including me. I learned what happened in that session through the subsequent behavior of the participants, through the particular quality of their speech in the following weeks, which had the tightened, deliberate quality of men carrying information they had decided not to share. My lord was summoned to Edo. He was gone for most of the remainder of that year. When he returned, he was thinner, and he had the look of a man who has been given a task whose specifications he cannot fully communicate, and whose difficulty he cannot entirely acknowledge. My colleague who had introduced me to the reading group became, in the months following the Perry arrival, considerably more active in political circles that I was not part of, and that he was now careful not to discuss with me. I understood the carefulness. He was not certain whose side I was on. I had not given him reason to be certain. I had gone to the reading group. I had asked careful questions. I had not joined the organizing that had followed. He was a man making a serious decision about where to invest his loyalty in a situation where the wrong choice would be, at best, career-ending, and at worst, fatal. I could not tell him which side I was on because I genuinely did not know. I was a man who had been formed entirely by one world, and was watching that world develop a crack so wide that it was becoming possible to see the outside through it, and I had not yet decided whether I was going to step through the crack or try to repair it. The night I make most vivid in my memory from those years is not a night of political drama or confrontation. It is an ordinary night in the winter following Perry's second visit, the visit in which the Convention of Kanagana was signed and Japan formally, irrevocably opened. I was lying in bed in the dark in the hour before the first bell, and my wife was awake beside me. We were both lying still in the way that people lie still when they are not asleep. After a time she said, without preamble, without the careful indirection of our usual serious conversations, "I think you need to decide what you believe. Not what you are supposed to believe. What you actually believe." I didn't answer immediately. The silence lasted long enough that she might have thought I was asleep, except that she knew I wasn't. Finally, I said, "I believe the domain will survive this. I believe there are men of intelligence and good faith in the administration, and they will find a way to preserve what is essential and accommodate what cannot be resisted." She was quiet. Then she said, "That is what you hope." I asked what you believe. We did not speak again that night. But in the morning I woke with the knowledge that she had given me something important, and that the most honest answer to her question was one I had not given, and that not giving it was its own form of decision. What I actually believed in the winter of 1853 to 54, when I allowed myself to look directly at what I believed, was this: the world I had been born into, the world I had loved and served and shaped my life around, was ending. Not in a year, not all at once, but in the way that things end when the conditions that sustained them have changed, gradually, then irreversibly, then complete. The 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa order were drawing to a close. The process would be long and uncertain and painful, and I did not know what would come after it, and I was afraid of not knowing, and underneath the fear was a smaller, quieter thing that took me longer to identify, something that was not quite hope, but was the ancestor of hope, the recognition that endings are also openings, that the closing of one world is the condition of the possibility of another. In the months that followed, I made a decision that seemed small at the time, and that I now understand as the hinge on which the second half of my life turned. The domain's senior administration was assembling a working group to consider how the domain should adapt its administrative and military structure in light of the changed political situation. The work was practical and unglamorous. It involved reviewing land surveys, assessing the domain's productive capacity, considering what kinds of institutional change would be feasible within the domains, resources and what kinds would require central authority that the domain did not have. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of document management work that I had been doing for 20 years, applied to a new and more urgent problem. I requested a position on the working group. My request was unusual. Administrators of my seniority did not typically request positions. They waited to be assigned to them. The senior administrator who received my request looked at me for a moment with an expression I could not read, and then said yes. The working group met twice weekly in a room adjacent to the administrative hall. I was the oldest member by several years. The other members were younger men who had grown up with the Randachu literature as a normal part of their intellectual landscape, who spoke about Western institutions and Western military technology with a directness and a depth that I found simultaneously unsettling and illuminating. They had done what I had been reluctant to do. They had looked at the world from outside the world. They had read the accounts of the Opium War with full attention and drawn the conclusion that the texts of Chinese civilization that had formed the ideological foundation of our own civilization's claims to superiority were not, in the end, protection against Occidental canon. They had looked at this conclusion and stayed with it and let it do its work on their understanding, and they had come out the other side of that, looking as men who were still deeply Japanese, still formed by everything that had formed me, but who were now also formed by the knowledge that the forms of their Japanesness were not the substance of it. I spent 3 years on that working group. They were among the most intellectually demanding years of my life. I learned more during those years than I had learned in any equivalent period since my formal schooling. Not facts, exactly, but ways of seeing. The habit of distinguishing between the form of a thing and its function. The practice of asking about any institutional arrangement, what problem it was designed to solve, whether it was still solving that problem, and if not, whether the problem still needed solving, or whether the world had simply changed in ways that rendered the original problem irrelevant. I applied this practice in those years to everything around me, to the domain's administrative structure, to the military organization, to the social hierarchy, and eventually, unavoidably, to myself. The question I arrived at through this process was simple in its formulation and took years to answer. What was I underneath the category? If you removed the stipend, the sword, the formal dress, the social grammar of deference and hierarchy, if you removed all the forms in which my samurai identity had been expressed, what remained? What was the substance that the forms had been containing? I found, to my initial surprise and eventual comfort, that the answer was not nothing. There was something inside the forms that was genuinely mine, genuinely valuable, genuinely capable of surviving the removal of its container. The habit of attention, the capacity to be present with a task or a person without the distraction of self-interest, which is what the sword practice had actually been teaching me all those years. The commitment to honesty and record-keeping, which sounds like a modest virtue, but which I had come to understand as a form of moral seriousness. The insistence that what happened was recorded accurately, that the institution's memory corresponded to what actually occurred, that the paper did not lie, even when the circumstances made lying convenient. The capacity for service, not the servility that a later generation would sometimes confuse with service, but the genuine willingness to subordinate private preference to the good of the whole. These were real. These were mine. These had not been given to me by the Kokagawa system. I had developed them through the Tokugawa system, but the development was mine, and the understanding that they were mine, that they did not depend on the system for their existence or their value, was the beginning of what I can only call freedom. Not the freedom of a man who has cast off obligations, the freedom of a man who has understood that his deepest obligations are not to a system, but to the qualities that the system, at its best, had been trying to cultivate. The events of the middle 1850s and 1860s moved through my life the way weather moves through a landscape, sometimes directly felt, sometimes observed from a distance, always present as the context in which every particular moment occurred. The signing of the Harris Treaty in 1858, opening Japan to Western trade on terms that many of us found humiliating, produced a political crisis that expressed itself in assassinations and the shogunate's brutal suppression of its critics. the Ansei Purge, in which men I knew were imprisoned, exiled, or executed for the crime of having expressed an opinion about Japan's foreign policy, and in a gradual hardening of the division between those who wanted to preserve the Tokanano order in some modified form and those who wanted something more radical. The assassination of Tu Naosuke, the shogunate regent who had authorized the Ansei Purge, at the Sakuradaman Gate in 1860, hit me with a force I had not anticipated. Not because I had admired, I had not. His suppression of intellectual dissent had seemed to me both unjust and strategically counterproductive. But because the manner of it, a group of samurai from Mido domain, acting in the name of the emperor and the expulsion of foreigners, cutting down the most powerful man in the shogunate's government outside the shogun's own household, made concrete what had previously been theoretical. The old order was not going to manage its way out of this crisis. The crisis was going to be violent, and the violence had begun. I want to tell you about a conversation I had during those years with a young man named Fukami, who had been assigned to our working group as a junior member shortly after the Harris Treaty. He was perhaps 23 when I met him, and he had been educated partly in Nagasaki under a curriculum that included significant Western content, science, European history, enough English to read technical documents. He was quiet in the group sessions, not from shyness, but from the specific kind of quietness that comes from having thought more carefully about something than anyone else in the room. When he spoke, which was infrequently, the group tended to stop and attend. One afternoon we were walking back from the administrative quarter along the same path I had walked every working day for 2 decades. The trees were the same trees. The temple bell was the same bell. The smoke from the same houses rose in the cold air in the same patterns. And Fukami, who had grown up somewhere entirely different, and to whom this landscape was not the architecture of his whole life, said something that I have thought about ever since. He said, "What strikes me about this place is that everything that can change has changed except what everyone is looking at." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The economy has changed. The political balance has changed. The international situation has changed. The ideas being discussed have changed. But when you walk through this street, you see the same buildings and the same clothes and the same bows and the same patterns as 50 years ago. The form has stayed constant while everything underneath it has transformed. That is a condition that tends to resolve itself abruptly." I walked in silence for a while after that. The 12-minute walk felt longer that day. I thought about what he had said and about whether he was right. I concluded by the time I reached my door that he was probably right about the condition, but wrong about the implication. I thought the resolution did not have to be abrupt. I thought there were people of good faith and intelligence within the system who were already working on the resolution, and that if they were given enough time, the transition could be managed. I was not entirely right about this, but I was not entirely wrong either. The resolution was abrupt in places, violent, destructive, irreversible, and it was managed partially by people of good faith who had been working on it for years. History does both things at once. I have since made my peace with history's tendency to do both things at once. By the early 1860s, my lord's household was operating in a state of managed urgency that I found simultaneously exhausting and meaningful. The domain was acquiring Western weapons, rifles, early artillery, and reorganizing its military structure around a mixed, force that combined the traditional samurai units with a new conscript infantry drawn from the commoner population. This reorganization was, from the perspective of the official hierarchy, a profound anomaly. Farmers carrying Western rifles and fighting alongside samurai was not what the four-tier social order had imagined. In practice, it was becoming the only military organization that could function against a modern opponent. I was involved in the administrative side of this reorganization, the documents that recorded it, the budgets that funded it, the personnel files that tracked it, and I watched it happen with a mixture of historical vertigo and professional absorption that I could not entirely separate from each other. The question that organized my internal life in those years was not political, not strategic, not about which faction would win or what the new order would look like. It was more personal than that. It was the question of how to act day by day, when the framework that had given your actions their meaning was in the process of being replaced by a framework that did not yet fully exist. How do you maintain integrity when the categories that defined integrity are changing? How do you serve when the institution you serve is mid-transformation? How do you remain who you are when who you are has been defined by conditions that are no longer the conditions? I found my answer gradually through the practice I had kept since childhood. Not the sword practice, though I continued that. The practice of attending to what was actually in front of me, the documents, the conversations, the people, the specific problems of the specific day, with full presence, without the distraction of either the past I was losing or the future I couldn't see. The quality of attention that my childhood training had been building, through all the repetitive rituals and forms and hierarchies, was exactly what the moment required. Not the content of the training, not the specific loyalties and specific obligations to specific institutions, but the quality, the capacity to be present, the capacity to act from integrity rather than from fear, the capacity to continue. This sounds, perhaps, like something a person says after surviving a difficult period in order to make the surviving seem principled. I want to be honest. It was also, some days, simply the inability to do anything else. When the world around you is reorganizing at a pace that exceeds your capacity to make meaning of it, continuing to do the immediate task in front of you is sometimes not a philosophical position, but a form of holding on. I held on. I did the work. I attended the meetings. I wrote the documents. Some days this was principle, and some days it was stubbornness, and some days it was the fact that I needed to eat and my children needed to eat in the household, needed my income, and there was no option that didn't involve continuing to function. Stubbornness is underrated as a philosophical position. The Boshin War, when it came in 1868, did not come as a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. The Sacho alliance of Choshu and Satsuma domains, combined with the political fiction of restoring imperial rule, had been building toward a military confrontation with the shogunate for years. When it came quickly by the standards of what had preceded it. The shogunate's forces were defeated in a series of engagements. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, surrendered Edo without the destructive battle that had been anticipated. The new Meiji government moved into power with a speed and a comprehensiveness that reflected, I think, how long it had been prepared for. Our domain navigated this transition with the particular care of men who had spent several years preparing for exactly this kind of situation. The domain sided, ultimately, with the new government. This was not a foregone conclusion. Some domain lords held out longer, some much longer, and the transition, in our case, was managed with enough smoothness that the essential administrative functions continued without significant interruption. This smoothness was, in some part, the product of years of working group meetings and administrative preparation. It was also, in some part, the product of the specific quality of our Lord, who had the rare combination of genuine intelligence about his situation and genuine humility about his ability to resist it. The day I stopped carrying a sword in public was, I had been told by others who had reached it before me, a significant day, an expected weight missing, the right hand uncertain of itself. I had heard this description, and I thought I had understood it. I had not understood it. The absence of the sword was not primarily a physical sensation, it was an ontological one. The sword had not been primarily a weapon, not in my lifetime. It had been primarily a marker of identity, a signal to the world and to myself about what category of person I was, what obligations I held, what grammar I spoke. To walk through the street without it was to walk without the visible evidence of my social self, to be legible only as a private person, as a body moving through space without the symbol that gave the movement meaning. I was 52 years old that year. I had been carrying a sword in one form or another since I was 15. The absence of it in the first weeks felt like a small death. Then it felt like something else. It felt like the clarifying sensation of finding that you can breathe more easily than you thought you could, that the weight you were carrying, though real and though genuinely yours, was also genuinely heavier than you needed it to be. The new government's reforms came with a comprehensiveness that I found at once admirable and vertiginous. The samurai classes' stipends were commuted into government bonds, a transaction that was, depending on your perspective, a fair settlement or a theft or an act of historical mercy that preserved more dignity than simply ending the payments outright. I received my bond certificate and held it in my hands for a long time. It was a piece of paper. It was the capitalized value of 4 generations of my family's service expressed as a financial instrument. It was, in the most literal possible sense, the form of my inheritance converted into a substance that the new world could handle. I found work in the new prefectural administrative structure. The Meiji government needed administrators desperately, men who understood how to manage records, how to coordinate institutional memory, how to keep the machinery of governance running through a period of comprehensive transformation. The skills I had spent 30 years developing turned out to be entirely transferable. The domain's seal became the prefecture's seal. The Lord's correspondence became the governor's correspondence. The lacquered boxes of documents were reclassified according to the new administrative categories and remained exactly where they had been, in exactly the same room, managed by the same hands that had been managing them for decades. This continuity, the deep institutional continuity, beneath the revolutionary surface change, was one of the things that the new government understood about Japan that outside observers watching the rapid social transformation tended to miss. Japan did not transform by destroying its institutions. It transformed by reconstituting them, by changing what they were for and who ran them and on what principles they operated, while keeping the basic administrative infrastructure intact. The men who could carry administrative knowledge across the discontinuity were essential. I was one of those men. This gave me a purpose that was, if anything, clearer and more urgent than the purpose I had held before. My son was admitted in the third year of the Meiji era, to a new Western curriculum school in the prefectural capital. He studied English and mathematics and Western history and natural science. He came home in the evenings with a mind full of information and frameworks that I could not always follow, and he explained things to me with a particular combination of earnestness and mild condescension that is the specific texture of a young person educating a parent. I absorbed what I could. I asked questions that probably revealed the limits of my absorption. He answered patiently. We were both learning something in those conversations. He was learning how to explain what he knew, and I was learning that the category of things worth knowing was considerably larger than the category of things I knew. There was an evening in the garden a few years after the Meiji transition when I sat with my wife in the last light and we looked at the garden together without speaking for a long time. The old stones were in their place. The season was late summer, the light golden and declining. She was tending something at the edge of the garden with the same careful attention she had always brought to the garden, the same attention her own mother had brought to a garden years before, in a different life. The form of the attention had persisted across the transformation. The specific things being tended had changed somewhat. The attention itself was continuous. I thought, sitting there in the golden light, about the question my wife had asked me in the dark of that winter night years before. What do you actually believe? I had not answered the question then, not honestly. I had given her what I hoped, and she had known the difference. I thought I could answer it now. I thought, not saying this aloud, but forming it carefully in the interior where I had been forming careful thoughts for 50 years, I believe that what we were given was not a system. We were given a practice, a way of moving through a world with attention and integrity, and the willingness to serve something larger than our own comfort. The system that the practice was embedded in was a specific arrangement, suitable to specific conditions, and the conditions changed. The system had to change with them. But the practice was not the system. The practice was something that the system had, at its best, been trying to transmit, and the transmission had succeeded in ways that outlasted the transmitter. I believe that the people who came before me, my father, his father, the generations of careful men who copied documents and practiced sword forms and maintained the grammar of deference, and tried to inhabit their positions with integrity, were not deluded. They were not performing an empty ceremony. They were doing something real. They were cultivating, through the forms available to them, qualities that are genuinely valuable. The forms broke. The qualities survived. I believe that every civilization discovers, eventually, that it has been a vehicle for something that it was not entirely aware of carrying. The vehicle changes. The cargo continues. My son finished his schooling and entered the Meiji civil service, where his skills in English and mathematics and Western administrative frameworks made him immediately useful. He wore Western clothes to work and traditional clothes at home, and moved between the two registers with an ease that I found remarkable, not as a contradiction but as a synthesis, as the particular Japanese competence at taking in foreign forms and making them serve native purposes. He was a Meiji man. He was also entirely my son. The continuity ran through the discontinuity, the way a river runs through different landscapes. It is still the same water. My daughter married a man who had been trained as a doctor in the Western medical tradition. He was a man of great seriousness and genuine warmth, and he treated my daughter with a respect that pleased me enormously and that I recognized, without being able to fully articulate why, as the same quality I had always associated with my father's generation, the specific combination of formal responsibility and genuine care that is the best version of what my tradition had been trying to produce. He wore a white coat instead of formal dress. He had a different vocabulary for the same virtues. I continued to work until I was 63, when an illness that was not severe but was persistent persuaded me that the work of maintaining institutional memory could be handed to someone else without significant damage to the institution. I trained my successor carefully. I organized the document archives with a thoroughness that the successor found excessive and that I found merely appropriate. I wrote memoranda about archival practices that were more detailed than anyone had asked for, and that I hope were useful to people I would never meet. In my retirement, I began writing what I thought of as testimony. Not memoir, exactly. Not the story of my life organized around what I had done and what had happened to me. Something more like a record of what it had felt like to be alive in a world that was ending from inside the world before I knew it was ending. A record of the texture of the daily practice, the quality of the morning silence, the weight of the formal dress, the conversation at the evening table, the particular sense that the world was correct and permanent that I had carried for the first 40 years of my life, and that I now understood, with the affection of someone looking at a childhood photograph, as the most beautiful misapprehension I have ever held. I wrote about the day the black ships came, and what the smoke on the horizon looked like, and what the domain's messengers' faces looked like, and what it felt like to lie in bed that night, in the dark beside my wife, both of us awake, both of us feeling the specific quality of a world that had just received information it could not fully process and had not yet decided what to do with it. I wrote about the working group and Fukami and the conversations that had changed how I understood what I was made of. I wrote about the day I walked out of my house without a sword for the first time in 37 years, and found that my right hand did not, after all, know what to do with itself. I wrote, most carefully of all, about the practice, about what I understood it to have been, now that I could see it from outside the system that had contained it. I wanted my son and his children and anyone who came after them to understand that the forms they had inherited, whether those forms were Western suits or traditional gardens or the specific quality of attention that the word Bushido tried and mostly failed to describe, were vehicles, important vehicles. Vehicles worth caring for and transmitting, but vehicles. The cargo was something they would have to find for themselves, through their own practice, through their own version of the daily discipline that produces over years the capacity to act from integrity rather than from fear. This, I wrote, is what the world before them was trying to give them. Not a system, not a hierarchy, not a set of rules about who bows to whom and how deeply. Something harder to describe and harder to transmit and more durable than any of those things. The quality of presence. The commitment to honest attention. The willingness to serve something larger than yourself, even when, especially when, the something larger is not a system you can see, but a value you have to carry without institutional support. It is enough. I believe it is enough. I have lived inside an ending, and the ending was real, and the world that came after the ending was also real, and there was a thread of continuity between them that ran through people rather than through institutions, through the specific qualities that the practice had cultivated in the people who inhabited it, and that those people carried forward into the new world even when the forms that had contained the practice were gone. My wife tends the garden in the early mornings still. The 3 old stones are still there, though she has arranged them differently from how I had them, and she is right that her arrangement is better. The light comes through the same gap in the eastern fence that it has always come through. The bell at the temple rings at the same intervals. The world has changed so completely that the grandfather of the man I was at 30 would be unable to recognize it, would be unable to understand the language of daily life, would be baffled by the clothes and the buildings and the machinery and the entire texture of the ordinary day. And yet, the silence before dawn still has its particular quality. The morning still waits briefly in the way of mornings before the day consents to begin. A person still wakes in that silence and has a moment before the day comes in, a moment that belongs entirely to the interior, to the small fire of attention that each person tends alone, in the dark, before the world asks anything of them. In that moment I am still entirely myself. The world changed. I changed with it. The moment did not change. And in the moment, in the silence before the first bell, in the particular quality of the darkness before the light, I find that everything that mattered is still here. Not in its old form, in a form I could not have imagined when I was young, but here, continuous. Real. That is what I want to leave you with, as you let the darkness settle over you, and the day recedes and the small fires of your own attention begin gently to bank. Things end. Things transform. The forms break and new forms appear, and the new forms will eventually break in their turn, and there will always be people inside the breaking who can only feel the loss and not yet see the continuity. Be patient with them. Be patient with yourself when that person is you. What was true remains true. The practice survives the system. The quality survives the form. The silence before dawn is the same silence it has always been, in every era, in every world, before every day that has ever been asked to begin. Listen to it now. It is yours. It has always been yours. It will still be yours when the world you inhabit has become, to the world that comes after it, as distant and as beautiful as mine has become to you. Let it carry you. Let the silence carry you. Let the darkness be what it is, not an absence but a presence, not an ending but the condition of all beginnings. The same darkness that closed over every samurai and every merchant and every farmer and every child who ever lived, inside the world I am describing, and who closed their eyes at the end of the day and returned, for a little while, to the place before categories, before forms, before the grammar of who bows to whom and how deeply, the place where we are all finally simply here. Rest now. The morning will come when it comes. The world will ask what it asks. But for now, for this moment, the silence holds. The practice continues. And somewhere in the dark before a Japanese dawn, in a world that no longer exists except in memory and in the qualities it managed to transmit forward through time, a man lies still and listens and is grateful for the particular beauty of a world he was given to inhabit, even knowing, especially knowing, that all given worlds must eventually be returned. Good night. Sleep well. The thread continues. There is something I have not yet told you about the quality of work in those years, the years of my late 30s and early 40s, when the domain was tightening and the world outside was unsettled, and the gap between the official account of things and the actual texture of daily life was widening in ways that required increasingly elaborate management. I have told you about the documents and the stipend and the informal loan from my wife's family, but I have not told you about the experience of being inside an institution that is beginning, very slowly, to doubt itself. An institution that doubts itself does not announce the doubt. That would be the one thing it cannot do, because the announcement would accelerate the very process it is trying to manage. Instead, the doubt circulates through the institution, the way cold air circulates through an old building, through gaps and cracks and small failures of insulation, felt by everyone, diagnosed by no one, endured by all. I felt it in the administrative office as a change in the rhythm of certain conversations. Discussions that would previously have moved to resolution within a single meeting now developed a tendency to circle, to arrive at provisional conclusions, and then reopen, as though the participants were not fully trusting their own judgment, as though each decision carried the weight of a question about whether the framework that made the decision legible was still intact. I felt it in my own work as a specific friction that I had not previously encountered. I would complete a document, a land survey review, an assessment of domain revenue, a correspondence log, and in the moment of completing it, I would experience a small but distinct hesitation, not about the accuracy of the content, about whether the category in which I was filing it still corresponded to a real distinction in the world, whether the world outside the document had reorganized itself in ways that the document's categories could not yet describe. A document is a claim that reality has a certain structure. The structure is real enough to be recorded. When the structure begins to change faster than the documents can be updated, you start to notice the gap, the place where the record diverges from what you can observe directly. I noticed this gap widening through the early 1840s with a precision that was the professional hazard of a man whose entire career had been organized around the maintenance of accurate records. I could see in the documents I was producing the traces of an institution trying to describe a reality that its categories were no longer adequate for. I want to tell you about a specific document, because the specific is always truer than the general, and because this document stayed with me in a way that I have never fully explained to anyone. It was a routine assessment of the domains tax collection from a set of rural villages in the Eastern Agricultural District, a document I had produced versions of following the same template for 15 years. The assessment compared the current year's rice collection against the previous year and against the 5-year average. It calculated the shortfall, identified the villages most affected, and made recommendations for the handling of tax arrears. The numbers were, that year, significantly worse than any year I had previously recorded. The shortfall was the largest in my 15 years of producing this document. The villages most affected were the ones that had been most affected the previous year, which had also been a bad year. The recommendations I was expected to make, the standard recommendations, the ones that had served adequately in years of moderate shortfall, were, I recognized as I wrote them, completely inadequate for the current situation. They were recommendations designed for a system under manageable stress. The system was no longer under manageable stress. It was under a different kind of stress entirely, one that the recommendations I was authorized to make could not address. I wrote the standard recommendations. I filed the document. I sat for a moment in the afternoon light of the administrative office, listening to the sound of the other administrators' brushes on paper and I thought, what I have just produced is an accurate account of a situation that my accurate account cannot help. The document is correct. The document is useless. The document is a record of the world's inability to be addressed by the tools available for addressing it. I do not know if this seems like a small thing to you. It does not seem small to me, even now. There is a specific form of grief, quiet, professional, invisible from the outside, that comes from understanding that the tools of your craft can no longer reach the problem, that the gap between what you can see and what you can do something about has grown too wide to cross with the means available to you. I felt that grief that afternoon. I have felt it since on other occasions, for other reasons. It is not a grief that requires expression. It is simply a grief that needs to be acknowledged and then set down, because the work continues, and the work is still worth doing, even when the direct line between the work and the solution cannot be established. The merchant quarter continued to change through those years in ways that I watched with a complicated attention. I have mentioned the new buildings and the new textiles, and the prosperity that was visible in the merchant families my wife knew through her own family connections. But there was a quality to the change that went beyond prosperity in its conventional sense. What I was watching, without the vocabulary to name it, was the emergence of a new kind of social confidence, a way of occupying space and moving through the world that was not the confidence, a formal status which I knew well and understood completely, but something more immediate and less codified. It was the confidence of people who understood that their value to the actual functioning of the world was not dependent on their official position in the world's hierarchy. The merchants knew things about the economy that the samurai administrators did not know. They knew the prices of things. They knew the trade routes and the fluctuations and the difference between a bad harvest and a catastrophic harvest in terms of what it would do to the markets for the following 3 years. They knew the creditworthiness of institutions that the institutions themselves would not acknowledge needed to be evaluated. They held this knowledge not as a form of subversive power. Most of them were not, by temperament, political, but simply as a natural consequence of doing their work attentively in the world as it actually was rather than in the world as the official categories described it. My wife had grown up inside this kind of knowledge. She had absorbed it from her father in the same way I had absorbed the administrative grammar of the samurai world from mine, not as explicit instruction, but as the texture of daily life, the substance of everyday conversation, the things you knew because everyone around you knew them, and they were simply part of what the world was like. And she had spent our marriage navigating the gap between what she knew from her formation and what she was expected to know as a samurai's wife, a gap that required the same kind of careful management that the domain's finances required, the same daily arithmetic of presenting what was appropriate while sitting with what was real. I think about the resources she devoted to that management over the years, the intelligence that went into knowing what to say and what not to say, when to offer information and when to hold it back, how to give me access to what she understood without triggering the specific kind of samurai defensiveness that would have made the access useless. She managed me, and she did it out of respect and genuine care, and I was for many years too formed by my world to fully notice that I was being managed. When I finally noticed, I did not feel diminished by it. I felt something closer to gratitude, the gratitude of a person who understands late but not too late the quality of what they have been given. The reform era of the early 1840s produced, in our domain, a specific practical effect that I have not yet described. The tempo reforms required all samurai households to simplify their expenditures, to reduce the visible markers of a lifestyle that the shogunate had decided was contributing to the erosion of samurai seriousness. The practical effect in our household was modest, because our lifestyle had never been extravagant, and the simplifications required were simplifications of form rather than substance, small changes in ceremonial presentation that made no material difference to our daily lives, but that required me to write to the domain's administrative office acknowledging compliance with the new requirements. I wrote that letter of compliance carefully, as I wrote all letters carefully, and as I wrote it I was aware, with a clarity that I found uncomfortable, that the act of compliance was primarily an act of documentation, a paper record of an administrative category rather than a genuine change in behavior. The reform was producing documents rather than reform. This is the specific failure mode of institutions that have lost the ability to act on reality and have substituted the management of documentation for the management of the thing the documentation is supposed to describe. I had spent my career producing documents. I knew the difference between a document that described a real state of affairs and a document that described the category in which a state of affairs was being officially filed. The compliance letter was the second kind. I filed it in the correct category. I moved on to the next document. The practice continued. Let me tell you about the books. I have mentioned, in passing, that certain texts circulated through the samurai community with an urgency that their official titles didn't explain. I want to describe this more carefully, because the way ideas moved through our world was itself a form of evidence about the world's condition. Official knowledge in Tokugawa, Japan, flowed through official channels, the domain schools, the shogunate's academic institutions, the texts that were approved for study and circulation. This was not a complete account of knowledge. Alongside it ran a parallel circulation of unofficial knowledge, texts that were technically restricted or practically suppressed, texts from outside Japan that arrived through Dejima and were copied and passed hand to hand, texts from within Japan that said things the official channels preferred not to say. The parallel circulation was not hidden in the sense of being genuinely secret. It was conducted in the open, with a kind of carefully maintained ambiguity about whether it was happening at all. Everyone knew it was happening. Nobody announced it. The physical form of this circulation was specific. A man would lend a text to a colleague with a slight additional quality of casualness, the casualness of someone who wanted to signal that the lending was unremarkable, that there was nothing here that required special attention. The colleague would read it, return it with the same casual quality, and perhaps mention it in conversation using language just slightly below the specificity of direct reference, the language of implication and resonance rather than declaration. A small community of shared understanding assembled itself around the texts in this way. Not a movement, not an organization, nothing with the structure that would constitute a target. A network of people who had read the same things and were changed by having read them, and who were changed in ways they were not, for a long time, willing to name directly. I entered this network tentatively over several years. My first step was the reading group one have described. After that, a colleague lent me a text a historical account of the transition between the Heian and Kamakura periods, the last time a governing order had been comprehensively displaced by something genuinely different. The text was not transgressive in its content. What made it relevant was the question it implied. If such a displacement had happened before, could it happen again? What were its conditions? What did it look like from inside in the years before the displacement was complete? I read it over several evenings, in the room I used for private study, after my wife and children were asleep. I read it with the specific quality of attention I brought to important documents the attention of someone who understands that the thing being read is going to require an internal response that cannot be predicted in advance and therefore must be allowed rather than managed. I let it do what it did. When I finished, I sat for a while in the lamplight and thought about nothing in particular, which is another way of saying that I let my mind work on what I had absorbed without directing the process. What I came away with was not a political conclusion. It was something more personal. The text had described with a particular vividness of historical specificity what it felt like to be a person of genuine capability and integrity who was embedded in an institution that was losing the capacity to use what he had to offer, not through any failure of personal character, not through any abandonment of the values he had been given, simply because the gap between the institution's form and the world's actual demands had grown too wide, and the institution was now organized primarily around the maintenance of its own form, rather than the fulfillment of the purpose the form was meant to serve. I recognized that description, not entirely, not with the completeness that would have made me into an advocate for radical change, but enough to make it impossible to maintain, without effort, the comfortable position that everything was fundamentally fine. I returned the book to my colleague with the appropriate casualness. We spoke about the weather. We spoke about the domain's administrative schedule for the upcoming quarter. We went our separate ways. Neither of us mentioned the book or what it had contained or what either of us had thought about it. The silence was its own conversation in a language that required no translation because we had both been speaking it our entire lives. The arrival of Perry's ships when it came did not produce in me the simple shock that it might have produced in a man who had been paying less attention. I had been living for several years inside the awareness that something large was approaching, something that the current order was not equipped to absorb without transformation. The black ships were not the cause of this awareness. They were the confirmation of it. They were the moment when the approaching thing arrived at the official threshold, when it became impossible for the administrative machinery to continue, to process the signals and produce, through its characteristic solvent of bureaucratic language and managed delay, documents that described the situation in terms the existing categories could handle. The specific emotional experience of that confirmation was not what I had anticipated. I had expected something more dramatic, a kind of internal breaking, a before and after quality that would be unmistakable in the memory. What I actually felt when the news reached me was quieter and stranger than that. It was closer to recognition than to shock. The sensation of understanding, finally and completely, something that you have been understanding incompletely for years. The way a word that you have been mispronouncing your entire life suddenly resolves into its correct pronunciation, and you understand simultaneously the word you have always known, and the error you have always been making, and the gap between them. The world I had loved was not going to continue in its current form. This was now a fact rather than a possibility. And facts, once acknowledged as facts, have a different quality from possibilities. A possibility carries with it the hope that it will not occur. A fact carries only the question of what you're going to do with it. The question took me a long time to answer. I want to be honest about the length of the time, because I think there is something worth conveying in the honesty. I did not arrive at clarity quickly. I did not experience a sudden conversion, a moment of transformation in which the old perspective dissolved and the new one crystallized. I moved through the question over years, in the slow way that serious questions are moved through, by sitting with them, by carrying them into the ordinary work of the day, and allowing the ordinary work to do something to the questions, by returning to them in the evening when the work was done, and finding them slightly different from how they had been in the morning, slightly more worked, slightly more transparent in the places where they had previously been opaque. I moved through the question of what I believed about the world by continuing to live in the world, by continuing to do my work, by continuing to practice the forms that I had been given, not because I was certain they were still adequate. I was no longer certain of this, but because the practice itself, independent of the institutional structure that had authorized it, was still doing something real. The attention that the practice cultivated was still worth cultivating. The commitment to doing the work in front of me with full presence was still the correct response to being alive in a moment of genuine uncertainty. The forms I had been given were not the substance of my life. I was beginning to understand. But they were genuine vehicles for developing the substance. And you do not abandon the vehicle in the middle of the journey simply because you have begun to understand that the vehicle is not the destination. There were days in those years of the mid-1850s when I walked to work along the 12-minute path and felt something that I can only describe as the specific beauty of a world that you can see clearly because you know it is temporary. The trees along the path were the same trees they had always been, but I saw them with a different attention now, the attention of someone who understands that the conditions under which he will walk this path are finite, not because I was dying or because the path was going to be physically removed, but because the meaning of the path, the grammar that made it my path, the formal world that the walk was part of Pernev, the institutional context that made the 12 minutes an act of arrival rather than simply a displacement in space, that meaning was in the process of changing. To walk a path that you understand is temporary in a world that you understand is ending, with full attention. This is not sadness, or not only sadness. It is a form of gratitude that has been purified by the knowledge of its limit. I did not know how to be grateful for the world I lived in until I could see that I was going to lose it. This is one of the most uncomfortable things I know, and also one of the most true. I want to return, before I leave the middle period of my life, to the question of my wife's family. I have mentioned their prosperity and the role it played in our household's finances, and the managed silence around the loan of those years. But there is something more specific that I want to say about what I learned from watching that family navigate the Tokada or order from the other side of the official hierarchy. My father-in-law was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable discipline. He had built his business through the same qualities that I associated with the samurai ideal: careful attention, long-term thinking, the willingness to maintain a practice over years without immediate visible reward. He differed from me primarily in that his intelligence and discipline had been applied to understanding the world as it actually was, rather than as any hierarchy claimed it was. He had no official standing to protect, no category to maintain, no formal dignity that required the management of inconvenient facts. He simply looked at the world and responded to what he saw. In the years after Perry, as the political situation developed and the economic situation followed it, he adapted his business with a precision that I found, watching from the samurai side of the official divide, genuinely impressive. He developed relationships with domain officials who were navigating the new trade arrangements. He understood, before most samurai administrators did, what the opening of Japan was going to mean for domestic markets, and positioned his business accordingly. He spoke about these developments in the direct, specific, numerical language of someone whose relationship to reality did not require the mediation of official categories. When I began to understand that the world was changing, it was partly through watching him that I began to understand what a different relationship to reality looked like. He was not cynical. He was not contemptuous of the social order, even though the social order had officially placed him at the bottom of it. He simply had a different primary relationship with truth, a more direct one, less mediated, less organized around the maintenance of a particular self-conception. He looked at things and described what he saw. This was, I gradually understood, a more sophisticated practice than it appeared. I have, in my years of reflection on this, come to think that the four-tier hierarchy of the Tokugawa order was, among its other properties, a system for distributing relationships with truth. The samurai were positioned in a way that required them to mediate their relationship with reality through the maintenance of institutional identity. The merchants were positioned in a way that required them to have a direct relationship with reality, simply in order to survive. The official hierarchy gave the samurai the superior status. The actual conditions gave the merchants the superior epistemics. The hierarchy claimed to know more about the world than the merchants. The merchants actually did know more about the world than the samurai. This gap over 2 centuries produced the specific kind of institutional fragility that I spent my career administering and eventually watched collapse. I do not say this as a criticism of my class. I was my class. I was inside this epistemological arrangement for my entire working life. I managed the gap between what I officially knew and what I could actually observe with the same daily discipline that I applied to everything else. What I am saying is that the arrangement had a cost, and the cost was the slow accumulation of institutional misalignment, the growing distance between what the institution said was true and what was actually happening in the world, and that this misalignment was structural, built into the form of the arrangement itself, and was therefore not correctable by individuals of good faith working within the system, no matter how diligent or how intelligent. This is the hidden architecture that I want to name for you clearly before the narration moves toward its end. The Tokugawa order was not destroyed by the black ships. The black ships were the occasion. The order was undermined by 2 centuries of its own success, by the peace it had created, which allowed a commercial economy to develop that the order was not equipped to accommodate, by the stability it had enforced, which allowed a population of intelligent, educated administrators to accumulate whose capabilities exceeded the institutional roles available to them, by the philosophical tradition it had promoted, which contained within itself the seeds of its own critique. The ships arrived in Edo Bay and found a world that had been working on its own dissolution for 200 years. They simply made it visible, and in making it visible, they gave people like me, people who had been carrying a question in the dark, alone, for years, the strange and difficult gift of knowing that the question was now shared, that it was no longer a private doubt but a public condition, that the work of addressing it would be done collectively or not at all. The reading group I had attended, the working group one had joined, the conversations with Fukami and with my father-in-law and with the younger administrators who thought in frameworks I had not been given, these were all part of the collective working out of that condition. They were the institutions that formed in the gap left by the old institutions' failure to address reality, and they were, in their modest and unofficial way, where the actual thinking was getting done. I was part of that thinking in my modest capacity. This is what I want to say about the middle years of my life, the years that I am inclined to think of as lost years, the years of managed uncertainty and performed stability, and the quiet, grinding arithmetic of maintaining a dignity that was becoming, each year, slightly more expensive and slightly less well supported by the world's actual conditions. They were not lost. I was doing something in those years that had no official category and produced no official document. I was doing the slow, invisible work of understanding what I actually was underneath what I had been given to be. And that work, though it had no official recognition and produced no immediate result, was exactly what the following years required. When the world asked me to become something new, I had been, for a long time, quietly preparing. The years of the Boshin War and the Meiji transition are a period that I find myself summarizing in memory more than inhabiting, if that distinction makes sense. The acute period, the period when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, when the decisions being made would determine the shape of the world for the next generation, moved too fast and involved too much information for me to have experienced it as narrative. I experienced it as a series of specific moments, a messenger arriving at an unexpected hour, a meeting of domain administrators in which the tone was different from any previous meeting I had attended. The day the domain's military organization was reorganized under new command structures and new designations and the old titles. The titles that had organized my world for 50 years became quietly no longer current. I want to tell you about that reorganization meeting because it illustrates something about the way large changes actually happen, which is not the way the histories usually describe it. The meeting was held in the main administrative hall, which could accommodate all the domain's senior staff. There were perhaps 40 people in the room. The senior administrator who had called the meeting spoke for about 30 minutes. He explained the new structure in terms that were, for the most part, technically straightforward, the administrative language of organizational change, which I had been producing documents about for years, and which had a grammar of its own, efficient, careful, deliberately, without drama. Toward the end of his presentation, he said something that I did not expect. He said, "The domain's purpose, which is to ensure the welfare of the people of this domain and to fulfill our obligations to the nation, does not change. What changes is the form of our service. The form changes because the conditions change and because we serve the purpose and not the form. I ask each of you to hold this distinction." The room was quiet for a moment after this. not the silence of agreement or disagreement, the silence of people absorbing something that required absorption. I was one of those people. I had thought about this distinction between form and purpose for years. I had worked my way toward it slowly through history and through experience and through the specific epistemological education that my father-in-law had offered by simply living his life in my vicinity. But to hear it said directly in the main administrative hall by a senior administrator in the grammar of official institutional communication, that was different. It made the distinction official. It made it a category that the institution could now work with. I felt, sitting in that room in the third year of the Meiji era, something that I want to name carefully because I think it is genuinely important. I felt recognized, not celebrated, not praised, not promoted. Recognized in the sense of having something true about my internal life acknowledged, finally, by the world external to it. The question I had been carrying privately through years of careful professional silence was now the official question. The institution had caught up to where the thinking had been for years, and the appropriate response was not triumph, but something more like relief, the relief of a person who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally been offered help with the holding. I held the distinction as I had been asked to. I still hold it. It is one of the things I intend to leave behind me when I am no longer here to hold it, not as a document, but as a practice that I have tried to transmit through the quality of my attention and the character of my work to the people who have worked alongside me. Form serves purpose. When the form is no longer serving the purpose, the form must change. The purpose continues. This is the samurai teaching that survived the samurai. Not the sword forms, not the hierarchy, not the formal dress, not the grammar of deference and obligation. The fundamental proposition that a life has a purpose beyond its own continuation, and that the purpose requires ongoing assessment and ongoing commitment, and that this assessment and commitment are more important than the preservation of any particular form the life has taken. My son knows this in his way. My daughter knows it in hers. The young doctor who is my son-in-law knows it in the grammar of his vocation, which is the grammar of attending to a particular human being with full presence and serving their actual welfare, rather than the category to which they belong. These are all different forms of the same practice. The practice continues in forms that I could not have imagined when I was young. This is what I wanted to tell you about the end of the Edo period. Not the politics, not the events, not the timeline. The practice, the quality of attention that it cultivated and the resilience of that quality, the way it survived the destruction of every institutional form that had been its vehicle, and continued in new vehicles, and continues still. Let this settle over you now, as the day recedes, and the night comes in, and the small fires of the day's concerns begin, gently, to bank. You are living inside conditions that will change, that are changing, that have already changed in ways you may not yet fully see. This is the permanent condition of human life in time. It was my condition. It was the condition of every person I have described to you. It is yours. The question is not whether the conditions change. The question is what you are developing through the practice of your own daily attention that will survive the changing. What is the substance that your forms are carrying? What will remain when the container is removed? I believe you know the answer. I believe you have always known it in the way that one knows things before having the vocabulary to name them. The practice of attention. the commitment to honest service, the willingness to be present with what is actually in front of you, rather than what the category claims should be in front of you. These are not complicated. They are not mysterious. They are simply hard in the specific way that all genuinely important things are hard, not technically difficult, but requiring a daily recommitment that has no end point, no graduation, no moment of completion that would allow you to stop recommitting. I recommitted every morning for 50 years. I recommitted in the dark, in the silence, before the bell, before the day's first demand. I did not always feel the recommitment as a choice. Some mornings it was simply the fact of waking up and deciding, again, to be the person I was trying to be, rather than the person fear was trying to make me. Some mornings the distance between those two people was small. Some mornings it was large. Every morning it was worth the crossing. There is one more thing I want to tell you about the nature of service, and about what I understand it to mean now that the specific institutional form my service took has been dissolved and replaced and partially dissolved again in the ordinary way of institutions. The word we used, the word that organized the interior life of the samurai class with more authority than any other single word, was loyalty. Sure, the character itself, in its written form, is a heart beneath a center line, the heart held at the center, organized around the center, disciplined into service of what stands above it. I copied that character thousands of times in my career, in documents and in correspondence, and in the calligraphy practice that my instructor assigned for reasons that had as much to do with moral formation as with aesthetic skill. I wrote it so many times that it lived in my hand as a kinesthetic memory before it lived in my mind as a concept. What I understood loyalty to mean when I was young was primarily formal. You owed loyalty to your lord. Your lord owed loyalty to the shogun. The shogun owed loyalty to the emperor. The emperor held the mandate that organized the entire structure from its apex. The loyalty flowed upward through the structure, the way water flows downward through a watershed, along paths defined by the landscape, predictable, directed, arriving eventually at a single point that gave the whole system its coherence. This understanding was not wrong, but it was incomplete in a way that I did not understand until the structure itself became unavailable as a reference point. When the shogun was gone and the domain structure was reorganized, and the emperor occupied a different position in the new order than the one he had occupied in the old one, when the entire landscape of the watershed was redrawn, I was left with the question of what loyalty meant in the absence of the channels it had always flowed through. The answer I arrived at over years, through experience, through the particular education of loss, was this: loyalty, at its most fundamental, is not an organizational relationship. It is a quality of attention. It is the commitment to be fully present with the obligations you have accepted, to bring to those obligations the full weight of your capability, and to maintain that presence and that commitment even when, especially when the circumstances make it easier to perform the commitment than to actually fulfill it. The distinction between performing loyalty and actually being loyal is the distinction that all genuine practice is built around. You can perform the forms of loyalty. You can produce all the correct external signs of a person who is fully committed to their obligations, while actually giving the obligation only what it costs to maintain the appearance of giving it everything. Most institutions at most times cannot distinguish between these two things. The institution receives the documents, the attendance at the meetings, the correct responses to the correct questions, and it cannot see, because institutions cannot see into the interior, whether the person producing these outputs is operating from genuine commitment or from the management of appearances. The practice can see this. The practice, the daily discipline, the martial art, the document work, the evening conversation, shows you, reliably and without mercy, whether you are actually present or only appearing to be. The form provides a surface that reflects your interior with a precision that nothing else quite matches. You cannot deceive the form because the form's only material is your own attention, and you know, in the privacy of your own attention, the difference between presence and its simulation. I was not always genuinely present. I was sometimes performing presence. I know this now with a clarity I did not have at the time, because the time required for that clarity is longer than a single working life. But I tried. I tried every day, in the specific way that trying looks when it is daily, and when the trying is not toward a goal that will eventually be reached, but toward a quality of engagement that must be renewed each morning, because it cannot be stored. This is the inheritance I want to leave. Not the stories, though the stories are real, and I hope they carry something. Not the historical record, though the historical record is important, and I have maintained it as carefully as I could. The inheritance I want to leave is this: the attempt itself, the daily recommitment to genuine presence over performed presence, the willingness to let the practice show you where you are actually located, rather than where you would prefer to be located. The understanding that this willingness is not a one-time act of courage, but a recurring choice, made again each morning, and that the value of the choice does not diminish with repetition, but increases, accumulates, the way all practice accumulates into something that eventually exceeds the sum of its individual acts. I am an old man now. The world around me bears so little resemblance to the world. I was born into that a younger version of me would not recognize it as the same landscape. And yet it is the same landscape, the same soil, the same hills, the same rivers, running from the same mountains to the same sea. The human forms that inhabit this landscape have changed. The institutions that organize this landscape have changed. The language in which this landscape is discussed has changed. But the quality that makes it worth inhabiting, the quality of attention that the landscape, at its best, calls forth from the people who live in it, that has not changed. That is the thing that was always worth transmitting. I close my eyes now at the end of the day with more ease than I could manage at most points of my life. The question that kept me awake, the question of what I believed, and whether what I believed was adequate to the world I actually inhabited, has been answered not completely, but sufficiently. I believed in the practice. I believe in it still. Everything else, the forms, the categories, the specific institutional arrangements, were vehicles and good vehicles, and I am grateful for them, even knowing that they were not the destination. The destination, if that word is appropriate for something that has no final point, is the quality of presence itself. The capacity to be fully here, in this moment, in this body, in this breath, in this silence, before the morning begins. That capacity is what every tradition I know of has been trying to cultivate through whatever forms were available to it, across whatever landscape of history it found itself inhabiting. The forms vary. The capacity being cultivated is the same. You are cultivating it now, By lying still and allowing these words to settle over you and doing the small work of remaining present with what they offer. This is not nothing. This is, in its modest way, the practice, and the practice, accumulated over years, over lifetimes, over generations, becomes the substance of a life, becomes the thing that remains when the forms are gone and the categories are dissolved, and the only question left is, what were you underneath all of that? I was this quality of attention, this commitment to honest service, this willingness to remain present with the difficulty of being alive in a world that would not hold still. This is what I was, this is what I leave. Sleep now. The world continues its business without requiring your attention for a few hours. The practice waits for you. It will be there in the morning, in the silence, in the moment before the day begins. It is always there. It has always been there. It will always be there. Good night.